Hey there, guys. Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Today I've got something really creepy for you. 7 scary train stories from old towns in the Appalachian Mountains. These things happen near train tracks and old stations deep in the mountains. The weird part? Even train workers won't talk about what they've seen up there. But first, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. And if you like spooky stories, give this video a thumbs up. And drop a comment telling me where you're from. I love hearing from you all. All right, ready for some chills? Let's jump right in. I'm 38 years old, and I used to be a quantum physicist. Used to be, because after what happened in those mountains, I can't look at equations the same way anymore. I can't even drive past a train crossing without my hands shaking. This was about 6 months after my daughter Sophia died. 8 years old, killed when a freight train hit our car at a crossing outside Asheville. The signals were working fine. The barriers came down like they were supposed to, but somehow the train was just there, like it materialized out of nowhere. The investigators never could explain it. Said the engineer swore the track was empty 1 second, then our Honda was right there in front of him the next. I couldn't handle going back to my research after that. Couldn't concentrate on particle physics when all I could think about was the physics of a 200-ton locomotive hitting a sedan at 60 miles per hour. So I took a sabbatical and rented a cabin up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, way out near this old abandoned observatory. I picked that spot specifically because there was no internet, no cell service, nothing to distract me from just existing, or trying to figure out how to exist without her. The cabin was maybe 2 miles down a gravel road from the observatory, built back in 1952 to track Soviet satellites during the Cold War, but funding dried up in the 70s and they just left everything there. Rusted dishes, old equipment buildings, cables running everywhere. The locals said it had been empty for decades. Perfect for someone who wanted to be alone with their grief. I'd been there about a week when I first heard the signals. I was having another one of those nights where sleep just wasn't happening, so I decided to hike up to the observatory around 2 a.m. The moon was bright enough to see by, and honestly, walking around old scientific equipment felt familiar. Comforting, maybe, or reminded me of better times when I actually cared about discovering things. Most of the buildings were locked up tight, but one of the smaller structures had a door that was hanging open. Inside, I found a room full of radio equipment that looked like it hadn't been touched since the Carter administration. Except when I flipped a light switch, everything hummed to life. Someone was still paying to keep the power on, apparently. That's when I heard it. This rhythmic beeping coming through the speakers. Not random static or interference. It had a pattern. Dit-dit-da, dit-da-dit. Like Morse code, but not quite. More like the communication signals railroads use to coordinate train movements. I spent the rest of that night trying to figure out what I was listening to. The signals were definitely coming from somewhere in space. The equipment was still pointed at the same coordinates it had been tracking decades ago. But the pattern was all wrong for satellite communication. It sounded exactly like the automatic block signals that control train traffic, except it was coming from deep space. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with those signals. I'd hike up there every night and listen for hours, trying to decode what I was hearing. My physics background helped a little. I could recognize some of the mathematical relationships in the signal patterns. They were coordinates, but not the kind you'd use for navigation on Earth. That's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. I cross-referenced the timing of the signal bursts with historical records, and they matched up perfectly with major train disasters. The first signal had started broadcasting the day after the worst train crash in North Carolina history, back in 1956. Another set began after a derailment in Virginia in 1978. And the most recent ones? They'd started the day after Sophia died. I tried to tell myself it was just coincidence, but the signals kept getting stronger every night. And stranger. Mixed in with the railroad codes were mathematical formulas that described geometric shapes that shouldn't be possible, spirals that curved in directions that don't exist, loops that folded back through themselves in ways that made my brain hurt just thinking about them. The night I finally decoded one of the complete formula sets, everything changed. I was sitting in front of the radio equipment, writing equations on an old whiteboard I'd found, when suddenly I could visualize the shape the math was describing. It was like a railroad track, but it twisted through dimensions I didn't have words for. And the moment I understood it, really saw it in my mind, the world outside the observatory started to bend. Through the window, I could see the old railroad tracks that ran along the base of the mountain. Except they weren't just running east and west anymore. They were stretching up into the sky, looping back under the ground, forming impossible spirals that hurt to look at directly. The tracks went on forever in all directions, including directions that shouldn't exist. That's when I saw them. Moving along those twisted tracks were things that might have been trains. If trains could be the size of city blocks and have wheels that rotated through dimensions my eyes couldn't properly process. They looked like massive mechanical serpents, all steel and steam and grinding gears, but they moved through space in ways that made no sense. The radio started crackling with a different kind of signal then. Not code this time, but something almost like a voice. It was trying to communicate with me directly, and somehow I could understand it. They weren't malicious, these cosmic train things. They were just traveling. They'd been using railroad tracks as navigation systems for longer than humans had existed, following routes that stretched across galaxies. Earth's rail network was just one tiny segment of an infinite transportation grid that connected entire solar systems. The problem was they existed partially in our dimension and partially in others. When their cosmic rail system intersected with human reality, accidents happened. They couldn't control where their tracks materialized in our world. Sophia hadn't been killed by a regular freight train. She'd been hit by something from another dimension, something that existed in the same space as that crossing for just a few seconds. Through the radio signals, they showed me other realities. Dimensions where the accident never happened. Where Sophia was still alive, still 8 years old, still laughing and asking me to explain why the sky is blue. They could take me there, they said. Transport me through their rail network to a reality where I could see her again. All it would require was destroying Earth's railroad system. Every track, every crossing, every rail line would have to be torn up to sever the connection between dimensions. Millions of people would lose their jobs, their transportation, their way of life. But I'd have my daughter back. I spent 3 days listening to their offer, watching those impossible trains move through twisted space outside the observatory. The entities were patient, ancient things. They'd been making this same journey for millennia. What was a few more days to them? But I kept thinking about all the other parents who'd lost children to train accidents. All the people who'd die if the transportation system collapsed overnight. I couldn't trade millions of lives for one, even if that one life meant everything to me. So I started sabotaging the equipment, changing the mathematical formulas in the signals, redirecting the cosmic coordinates away from Earth. If these things needed our railroad tracks to navigate, I'd give them new directions, send them somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't full of people just trying to live their lives. The moment I started broadcasting the new coordinates, the cosmic trains began shifting their route, but the process tore holes in reality itself. Railroad tracks across the country started, floating in midair as space-time broke down around them. The news was calling it equipment malfunctions, but I knew what was really happening. In one of the dimensional rifts that opened up near the observatory, I saw Sophia. She was standing on a platform that looked like our old train station, calling for me, telling me she was scared, asking me to come help her. I had maybe 30 seconds before the rift closed, before the cosmic trains finished changing course and moved away from Earth forever. I could have jumped through, should have jumped through. But something told me that sealing the rift was more important than saving myself, or even saving her. The breakdown in reality was spreading, threatening to consume everything. So I used my body to seal the dimensional opening, threw myself into the gap between realities just as it snapped shut. I don't remember the pain, just a sense of being stretched across impossible distances, my consciousness scattering along cosmic railroad tracks that stretched through the dark between stars. But I didn't die. Not exactly. My awareness merged with the railway network itself. I became part of the system these cosmic entities used to navigate the universe. And Sophia was there too. Her spirit somehow caught up in the same interdimensional rail system that had killed her. Now we work together, guiding these ancient travelers along routes that won't intersect with inhabited worlds. I've become the voice that warns railroad workers about cosmic interference. When engineers hear a woman's voice on their radio telling them to stop, to check the tracks, to wait a few minutes before proceeding, that's me, trying to prevent the accidents that happen when dimensions collide. Train crashes have dropped by 60% since I've been doing this job. Sophia helps too, her 8-year-old voice giggling through radio static as she guides the cosmic trains away from school crossings and playgrounds. I never got to take her to Disney World like I promised. Never got to teach her calculus or walk her down the aisle at her wedding. But we're together now, in a way, protecting other families from losing what we lost. Sometimes late at night, when a freight train passes through a small town, the engineer might hear 2 voices in the radio static. A woman and a little girl, making sure everyone gets home safe. That's us. Still working the rails, just on a much bigger scale than we ever imagined. I'm 67 years old, and I guess most people would call me a typical retired teacher. I spent 43 years in classrooms around West Virginia, watching kids grow up and move away to bigger cities. My sister Emma always said I should have done the same thing, but honestly, I never saw the point in leaving. That changed last month when Emma died. Cancer took her fast, and suddenly I was the only Thompson left. After the funeral, I found myself driving back to Millfield Junction for the first time in decades. I told myself I was just checking on the old family house before putting it up for sale. But if I'm being honest, I think I needed to see it one more time. My memory's been getting fuzzy lately, and I wanted to remember things the way they really were. The house sits right beside the active freight tracks where my father worked as a signal operator for 40 years. Growing up, those rails were like a heartbeat through our daily life. Dad would time everything by the train schedules, and I'd fall asleep every night to the sound of freight cars rolling past. The house looked smaller than I remembered, which I guess makes sense. Paint was peeling off the siding, and the front porch sagged like an old man's back. I hadn't been inside since 1994, right after Dad's funeral. Emma had wanted to sell it then, but I couldn't bring myself to let go. Now, looking at the overgrown yard and broken shutters, I wondered why I'd held on to it so long. I found the spare key exactly where Dad always kept it, under the loose board on the back steps. The inside smelled like dust and time, with that particular mustiness that comes from years of emptiness. Most of the furniture was still there, covered in sheets that had turned gray with age. What surprised me was finding Dad's old railroad journals and schedule books still stacked on his desk in the front room. I'd forgotten he kept such detailed records. Every train that passed, every signal he'd operated, every shift change for 4 decades. It was all there in his careful handwriting. As I flipped through the journals, something felt wrong about what I was reading. Dad wrote about passenger trains making regular stops at Millfield Junction, but I couldn't remember any passenger service here. According to his notes, the 3:47 a.m. passenger train ran every morning, taking workers to the coal operations up the mountain. But passenger service ended in West Virginia way before I was born, didn't it? I tried to think back to my childhood, but the memories felt slippery, like trying to hold water in my hands. That first night, I decided to sleep in my old bedroom upstairs. The bed was still there, along with some of my childhood things that Emma must have left behind. Around 3:30 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of a train whistle. Not unusual. Freight trains run all hours. But this whistle sounded different. Higher pitched, almost musical, like the old steam engines you hear in movies. I got up and looked out the window, expecting to see the usual long line of freight cars. Instead, I saw a passenger train pulling into a station. The problem was, there hadn't been a station at Millfield Junction since the 1960s. I'd watched them tear it down myself when I was in high school. But there it was, a small wooden platform with a covered waiting area and a hand-painted sign that read Millfield Junction. The train itself looked like something from an old photograph, with a black steam engine and passenger cars that had windows you could actually open. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The train was gone, and so was the station. Just the regular freight tracks stretching off into the darkness. I told myself I'd been dreaming, but I was wide awake. My heart was pounding, and I could still smell coal smoke, in the air. The next morning, I went through more of Dad's journals. The entries became stranger the deeper I read. He wrote about the same passenger train every day, describing the same passengers getting on and off. A woman in a blue dress who always sat in the third car. A man with a lunch pail who never spoke to anyone. Children who waved from the windows. According to Dad's notes, these same people rode the train every single day for years. I found photographs tucked between the journal pages. Pictures of me as a little girl, maybe 7 years old, standing beside the tracks and waving at a train. But I didn't remember Emma or Mom taking these photos, and they weren't in any of our family albums. In every picture, I was wearing the same yellow dress and holding the same doll. The date written on the back said July 15th, 1963, my 7th birthday. Looking at those photos, I started to remember that birthday differently than I always had. In my regular memories, Dad had to work a double shift and missed my party. But in these pictures, he was there, standing beside me and smiling. I could almost remember him lifting me up to wave at the train, telling me to make a wish as it passed. But that couldn't be right. Dad never missed work, not even for birthdays. That night, I heard the train again at exactly 3:47 a.m. This time, I was ready. I went downstairs and stood by the front window, watching the tracks. The whistle came first, that same musical note that didn't belong to any modern train. Then I saw the light, a warm yellow glow that bobbed slightly as it approached, like an old railroad lantern. The passenger train materialized out of the darkness like something emerging from deep water. The steam engine huffed and wheezed as it slowed, and I could see people moving around inside the lit passenger cars. The train pulled to a stop at the station that shouldn't exist, and passengers began getting off. They moved slowly, deliberately, like people who had all the time in the world. I pressed my face against the window to get a better look, and my reflection stared back at me. Except it wasn't my 67-year-old face looking back. It was me at 7 years old, wearing that yellow dress from the photographs. I stumbled backward from the window, but when I looked at my hands, they were still my old hands, wrinkled and spotted with age. The train whistle blew again, and through the window, I saw my father walking home along the tracks. He carried his lunch pail in one hand and his railroad lantern in the other, just like he used to. He looked exactly as he had when I was 7, tall and strong with dark hair and calloused hands. But something was wrong with his eyes. They were completely black, like holes burned through paper. Dad walked up to the front door and came inside without knocking. He hung his lantern on the hook by the door and set his lunch pail on the kitchen table, just like he'd done thousands of times when I was little. "How was your birthday party, Maggie?" he asked, his voice exactly as I remembered it. I tried to tell him I wasn't 7 anymore, that I was grown up and he'd been dead for almost 30 years. But when I opened my mouth, only a child's voice came out. "It was good, Daddy. I wished for you in the train." He smiled, but his black eyes never changed expression. "That's my girl. Did you wave like I taught you?" I nodded, even though I didn't remember learning to wave at trains. Dad picked up his railroad schedule book and showed me the page for July 15th, 1963. Every line was filled with the same train schedule, repeated over and over. 3:47 a.m. passenger service, 3:47 a.m. passenger service, 3:47 a.m. passenger service. "We can do this every day," he said. "Every day can be your birthday, and I'll never have to miss it again." The house started changing around us. The walls grew taller and the furniture shrank, or maybe I was getting smaller. My adult hands became clumsy and small, unable to work the modern light switches I'd used just hours before. The rooms filled with toys I remembered from childhood, my doll collection, the wooden train set Dad had built for me, coloring, books with pictures I'd drawn 60 years ago. Through the window, I could see the passenger train was still there, and it was full of children. They pressed their faces against the glass and waved at me, their mouths open like they were calling out, but I couldn't hear them. I realized they were all around 7 years old, and they all looked like they'd been waiting for something for a very long time. Dad sat down in his old chair and opened his journal. I died the day after your birthday, Maggie. Switching accident on the rails. You found my body, and you died too. Died of grief, the doctor said. A 7-year-old's heart just couldn't take losing her daddy. I looked around the room and saw our death certificates on the mantel, both dated July 16, 1963. But that couldn't be right. I'd lived my whole life after that. I'd gone to school, become a teacher, watched Emma grow up and get married. No, I said, and my voice sounded more like my own. I grew up. I had a life. Dad's face started to change. The skin began to sag and melt, showing the damage from the train wheels underneath. You created all of that to avoid the truth. You've been dead for 60 years, little girl. We both have. The other children in the train cars started screaming, begging me not to wake up. If I accepted the truth, their own family reunions would collapse too. All along the tracks, I could see other houses filled with families trapped in their last happy moments before tragedy struck. But looking at Dad's ruined face, I finally understood. I wasn't 7 years old. I was 67, and I'd come to this house to die. I'd driven here in a storm, planning to end my lonely life in the place where I'd been happiest. My car had skidded off the mountain road, and I'd died on impact. Everything since then, the memories of growing up, of teaching, of Emma's funeral, had been my dying brain creating, a better version of my story. The house began to shake and crumble. Wallpaper peeled off the walls like dead skin, and the floorboards rotted away beneath my feet. Dad's melted face looked at me with those empty black eyes. Choose, he said. Stay with me forever, or face the truth. I looked around at the collapsing house, at the screaming children in the train, at my father's destroyed face. Then I closed my eyes and chose reality. The house exploded into dust and railroad debris. When I opened my eyes, I was standing beside the real tracks, and there was no house at all. Just a foundation covered in weeds and 60 years of decay. My body was in my car at the bottom of the ravine, where it had been for weeks. The morning freight train rumbled past, and I felt myself fading away with its sound. For the first time in 60 years, I wasn't waiting for my father to come home from work. They found my body 3 weeks later. The newspaper said I'd had a heart attack exploring the old property, but the railroad workers who discovered me knew better. They'd been seeing a little girl waving at the trains for years, and now she was finally gone. The property got sold to developers who built new houses there. The families who moved in report hearing train whistles at 3:47 a.m., even though no passenger trains run anymore. Their children have imaginary friends who work for the railroad and always smell like coal smoke. Sometimes people still see a little girl in a yellow dress waving at the freight trains. She looks happy, and she's not waiting for anyone anymore. I'm 35 years old, and I work as a detective for the state of Tennessee. Been doing this job for about 12 years now, mostly handling missing persons cases and fraud investigations. Nothing too exciting, which is honestly how I prefer it. I grew up in Nashville, but my work takes me all over the state, including some pretty remote areas up in the mountains. This particular case brought me to a little town called Harmony, about 2 hours east of Knoxville, back in September of last year. The reason I was there was simple enough. 3 people had gone missing over the past 6 months, all from the same location. Harmony Station, they called it. Used to be an old train depot from the 1890s that got abandoned sometime in the 60s. A few years back, some historical society restored it as a tourist attraction. People would drive up from the cities to see this piece of railroad history, take pictures, buy little souvenirs. Seemed harmless enough. But then, folks started disappearing. First was a woman named Sarah Chen, 34, from Memphis. Divorced, no kids, worked remotely as a graphic designer. Security cameras showed her walking into the station on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Never came back out. Her car sat in the parking lot for 3 days before someone called it in. Next was Marcus Williams, 41, from Chattanooga. Lost his job during the pandemic. Been kind of drifting since then. Same story. Walked in, never walked out. Last one was Rebecca Torres, 28, from Nashville. Just got out of a bad relationship, was taking what she called a healing road trip through small towns. I'll be honest, when I first got assigned to this case, I figured it was pretty straightforward. People get overwhelmed, they run off, start new lives somewhere else. Happens more than you'd think. But the more I looked into it, the weirder it got. The station itself was beautiful, I'll give that. Whoever restored it did a hell of a job. Everything looked exactly like it would have in 1892. The wooden benches, the old-timey ticket booth, even the cast iron stove in the waiting area. They had a gift shop selling vintage postcards and railroad memorabilia. The whole place smelled like wood polish and old leather. But the staff, something was off about them from the minute I walked in. There were 4 of them working that day, 2 men and 2 women, all probably in their 30s or 40s. They were dressed in period clothing, which made sense for a historical site. What didn't make sense was how they talked. Not just the old-fashioned words they used, but the way they moved, the way they stood, like they were all reading from the same script. I started with basic questions. When did you last see Sarah Chen? What was she doing? Did she seem upset or disoriented? Standard stuff. But their answers were too perfect, too rehearsed. They all said essentially the same thing, using almost identical phrasing. The young lady appeared to be in good spirits. She purchased a postcard and inquired about the depot's operational history. She expressed satisfaction with her visit. Who talks like that? And they all did it, every single one of them. I asked to see the security footage, and that's when things got really strange. The cameras clearly showed all 3 missing people entering the building. The timestamps were accurate, the footage was clear, but there was no record of any of them leaving. I watched hours of tape, checking every angle. They just vanished. The building had been searched multiple times by local police and volunteers. It's not that big, just the main waiting area, a small office, a storage room, and a bathroom. There's nowhere to hide a person, let alone 3 people. But I searched it again anyway, checking for hidden panels, loose flute, boards, anything that might explain where they went. That's when I started noticing the inconsistencies in the building itself. The restoration was impressive, but some details were wrong. The wallpaper pattern wasn't quite right for the 1890s. The window hardware was reproduction, not original. Small things that most people wouldn't notice, but I'd developed an eye for details in this job. I decided to dig into who was behind the restoration. The plaques around the building credited something called the East Tennessee Historical Preservation Society. Sounded official enough, but when I tried to look them up, I hit dead ends. No phone number, no address, no list of board members. The state had no record of them as a registered nonprofit. For a society that had supposedly raised enough money to completely restore a historic building, they were remarkably invisible. That night, I went back to my motel room and started going through old newspaper archives online. If people had been disappearing from this station before, maybe there'd be some record of it. What I found made my blood run cold. The Harmony Herald, June 15, 1894. Mystery at local depot. 3rd traveler vanishes without trace. The article was short, but it described the exact same thing that was happening now. People would arrive at the station to catch a train, and they'd simply disappear. No one saw them leave. No one found any trace of where they'd gone. I found more articles spanning from 1892 to 1962. Always the same pattern. People would come to the station and vanish. Sometimes it was passengers waiting for trains. Sometimes it was just folks visiting. The disappearances would happen in clusters. 3 or 4 people over a few months, then nothing for years, then another cluster. The last article I found was from 1962. Harmony Station permanently closed after latest disappearances. According to the piece, 5 people had vanished in the span of 2 weeks. The railroad company, tired of the bad publicity and police investigations, decided to shut down service to Harmony for good. The building was boarded up and forgotten until 2019, when it was mysteriously restored and reopened as a tourist attraction. I called my sergeant that night and requested backup for the next day. Something was seriously wrong here, and I wasn't about to investigate it alone. But he told me the county sheriff had already spoken to the station staff multiple times, and they'd been completely cooperative. The state wasn't ready to commit more resources unless I found concrete evidence of foul play. So I decided to watch the place myself. I parked my car about a quarter mile down the road in a spot where I could see the station, but hopefully not be seen. Official hours were 9 a.m. to 6 p.m., but I wanted to see what happened after dark. Around 8 p.m., I saw lights come on inside the building. Not electric lights, oil lamps and lanterns like they would have used in the 1890s. Through my binoculars, I could see the staff moving around inside, but they weren't doing normal maintenance work. They were setting up equipment I'd never seen before. It looked like old telegraph machines and railroad communication devices, the kind of stuff that belonged in a museum. I watched them for hours. They communicated using hand signals and what looked like Morse code. Every movement was precise, coordinated. These people weren't just playing dress-up for tourists. They genuinely seemed to believe they were living in the 1890s. The next morning, I came back during regular hours and took another look around the building. This time, I was specifically looking for hidden spaces. Old buildings like this often had additions and modifications over the years. I found what I was looking for behind the main wall of the waiting area, a section that sounded hollow when I tapped it. I came back that night with a crowbar. What I found behind that wall changed everything. It was a room that hadn't been part of the original restoration, filled with modern surveillance equipment, computer monitors, digital cameras, audio recording devices. Someone had been watching and recording every visitor to the station for years. The computers were password protected, but I managed to get into some of the files. What I saw made me sick. Detailed profiles of hundreds of visitors, including psychological evaluations and personal histories. The 3 missing people all fit the same pattern. They were lonely, isolated, with few close relationships or family ties. Perfect targets for something. I followed one of the staff members home the next evening, keeping my distance. He didn't live in town. Instead, he drove about 10 miles up into the mountains to what looked like a private compound. Through the trees, I could see multiple buildings, houses, workshops, what might have been a meeting hall. And there were more people there, all dressed in the same 1890s clothing, all moving with that same strange, coordinated precision. Over the next few days, I did more surveillance and research. What I discovered was that this wasn't just some historical reenactment group. These people genuinely believed they were living in the past. They'd created an entire community based on rejecting modern life, and they were using the restored station to recruit new members. The missing people weren't dead. They were being held in the compound, undergoing some kind of psychological conditioning. The group's leader was a man named Thomas Whitmore, whose great-great-grandfather had been the original station master in the 1890s. He'd inherited not just the family obsession with the railroad, but also a detailed record of how to make people disappear. The process was sophisticated. They'd identify visitors who fit their target profile, people who were dissatisfied with modern life, isolated, vulnerable. Then they'd somehow convince these people to join their community voluntarily. Once they were in the compound, they'd be subjected to psychological manipulation, sleep deprivation, and wapuas, that I can only describe as a systematic erasure of their modern memories. I found the 3 missing people working as servants in the compound, dressed in period clothing and completely convinced they were living in 1894. They didn't respond to their real names. When I tried to talk to Sarah Chen, she looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. She insisted her name was Mary and that she'd always lived at the settlement. Getting evidence was the tricky part. I needed proof that these people were being held against their will, but they didn't seem to think they were prisoners. As far as they were concerned, they'd chosen this life. The legal situation was complex, to say the least. I managed to plant some recording devices around the compound and document their indoctrination process. What I captured was disturbing. Hours of repetitive conditioning sessions designed to convince people that their modern lives had been illusions, that they'd always belonged in the 1890s. But I got careless. One of their security people spotted me placing a camera, and suddenly I was surrounded by a dozen of these cult members. They didn't threaten me or hurt me, but they made it clear that I needed to leave and forget what I'd seen. When I refused, they tried to subject me to the same conditioning process they'd used on the others. It might have worked too if I hadn't been prepared for it. The technique seemed to rely on isolating people from modern concepts and memories, but I kept focusing on things they couldn't erase: my cell phone, my police radio, DNA evidence I'd already collected. Modern technology and procedures that proved their 1890s fantasy was just that, a fantasy. I managed to escape during a shift change and called for backup. The raid happened 3 days later. We arrested most of the cult members and rescued the missing people, though rescued might not be the right word. They fought us every step of the way, insisting they wanted to stay in their Victorian community. The psychological damage was severe. Sarah, Marcus, and Rebecca needed months of therapy just to remember their real names. They couldn't fully readjust to modern life. Sarah never went back to her job as a graphic designer. Marcus moved back in with his elderly parents. Rebecca ended up in a long-term care facility for people with severe PTSD. Thomas Whitmore and his core followers disappeared before we could arrest them. We found evidence that they'd been operating similar recruitment stations at restored historical sites in at least 6 other states. It was a national network, all designed to lure vulnerable people into isolated communities where they could be reprogrammed to live in the past. I ended up leading a federal task force to shut down the whole operation. We closed stations in Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Georgia, found more victims, arrested more cult members. But Whitmore himself was never caught. The Harmony station was shut down permanently and boarded up again. The building's still there, but no one goes near it now. Local people know what happened, and word gets around in small towns. I still work missing persons cases, but I approach them differently now. When someone disappears, I don't just look for where they might have gone. I look for who might have wanted to make them disappear. And I pay a lot more attention to places that seem too perfect, too authentic, too good to be true. Because sometimes the past isn't dead. Sometimes it's waiting patiently for the right people to come along. People who are tired of the present and looking for somewhere else to belong. And once it gets them, it doesn't like to let go. I never went back to Harmony. To this day, I take a different route when my cases bring me to that part of the state. Some investigations change you permanently, and this was definitely one of them. I sleep with my cell phone next to my bed now, just to remind myself what year it is. I was 17 when I stole $300 from my foster parents and bought a one-way train ticket to anywhere that wasn't Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. My name's Zoe, and honestly, I don't talk about this much because people think I'm making it up. But I'm 28 now, and I work with runaway kids, so I guess it's time I shared what really happened that night. See, the Pattersons weren't exactly abusive in the way you'd see on TV, no bruises or anything, but they had this way of making you feel like you were nothing. Like you were just another check from the state. I'd been planning to leave for months, saving up lunch money and odd job cash, waiting for the right moment. When Mr. Patterson threw my school project in the trash because it was cluttering up his house, that was it. I packed my backpack, took the money I'd hidden in an old jewelry box, and walked to the station. The last train out was at 11:47 p.m., heading north toward Pittsburgh. I figured a big city would be perfect. Lots of places to disappear, maybe find work under the table until I turned 18. The station was nearly empty except for this old guy behind the ticket counter who barely looked up when I paid cash. He just slid me the ticket and went back to his crossword puzzle. The train itself was one of those older models, not the sleek ones you see in movies. Dark green paint that looked black in the station lights, with windows that had that yellow tint like old photographs. When I climbed aboard, there were maybe 4 other people in the entire car. An elderly conductor with a thick white mustache checked my ticket and pointed me toward a seat near the middle. The other passengers were spread out. A woman in her 50s reading a paperback, an older man with a briefcase, and someone I couldn't really see clearly near the back. Nobody was talking. The whole car had this quiet, late-night feeling where everyone just wanted to mind their own business. I settled into my seat and watched Harper's Ferry slide past the window as we pulled out. Streetlights became farmhouse lights, then just darkness with the occasional glow of a distant town. I remember thinking this was it. I was finally free. No more walking on eggshells, no more pretending to be grateful for a roof over my head. I had enough money to last maybe 2 weeks if I was careful, and I'd figure out the rest from there. About 20 minutes into the journey, the train started slowing down. I looked out the window but couldn't see any station lights or platform, just trees and darkness. The conductor's voice came over the intercom, crackling through old speakers. "Brief stop ahead. Please remain in your seats." But when we came to a complete stop, I could see we were at some kind of station, just not one that had been on the schedule board back in Harper's Ferry. The platform was lit by these old-fashioned lanterns that cast long, flickering shadows. No station house that I could see, just a wooden platform that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. The whole place felt wrong somehow, like it was too quiet. Even for the middle of the night, there should have been some sound, insects, wind, something. But outside those windows, it was dead silent. That's when I saw him boarding. He was tall, maybe 6'4", wearing what looked like an old railroad uniform, the kind with brass buttons and a conductor's cap. But the uniform was faded and stained, like it had been worn for decades without washing. As he got closer, I could see that half his face was covered in burn scars, thick and ropey, pulling the skin tight around his left eye. He walked with this mechanical limp, like one of his legs wasn't quite working right, and he was carrying this large canvas bag that looked heavy. The conductor, the real conductor with the white mustache, he took one look at this guy and went pale. I mean, visibly pale, like he'd seen a ghost. But he didn't try to stop him from boarding or ask for a ticket. He just stepped aside and let him pass, then quickly moved to the next car. The scarred man looked around the car slowly, studying each passenger. When his eyes met mine, I felt this chill run down my spine. His good eye was this pale blue color, but it wasn't looking at me like I was a person, more like I was an object he was evaluating. He limped down the aisle and sat directly across from me, setting his canvas bag on the floor with a heavy thunk. That's when I noticed something was wrong with the other passengers. The woman with the paperback hadn't turned a page since he boarded. She was just sitting there, staring straight ahead at the seat in front of her. The man with the briefcase was the same, perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed forward. Even the person in the back, who I still couldn't see clearly, hadn't moved an inch. The scarred man opened his canvas bag and pulled out what looked like railroad spikes, the thick iron ones they used to secure tracks to ties. But these were sharpened to points, almost like ice picks. He laid them out on the seat beside him with careful precision, then pulled out a small whetstone and started sharpening one of them. The scraping sound echoed through the silent car. "Evening," he said, and his voice had this raspy quality like he'd damaged his throat in whatever accident had burned his face. "Name's Fletcher. I'm the ticket puncher on this line." I didn't know what to say to that. Ticket puncher wasn't a real railroad job, at least not anymore. Those were from like the 1800s. "Been working this route for, must be 40 years now," he continued, still sharpening the spike. "Make sure everyone's got proper passage. Some folks try to ride without paying their full fare, you understand." He held up the spike, examining the point in the dim car lighting. That's when I got a good look at the other passengers again, and my blood went cold. Each of them had a small, perfectly round hole in their forehead. Just a tiny puncture, like someone had driven a nail through their skull. But they were still breathing, still blinking occasionally. They just weren't there anymore. Like whatever made them human had been switched off. "Don't worry about them," Fletcher said, noticing my stare. "They've already had their tickets validated. Very cooperative passengers now. Do exactly what they're told." The woman with the paperback suddenly stood up and walked to the front of the car, moving like she was sleepwalking. She opened an overhead compartment and started reorganizing the few bags stored there, moving them from one side to the other for no apparent reason. When she finished, she sat back down and resumed staring forward. "See? Model passengers," Fletcher said with what might have been a smile. Hard to tell with the scar tissue. "Been riding with me for... Sarah, there's been aboard for 3 weeks now. Thomas with the briefcase, he's coming up on 2 months. They're headed to some nice work camps up in the mountains. Good, honest labor. They don't complain, don't ask for breaks, don't cause any trouble. I tried to stand up, thinking I could maybe make it to another car, but Fletcher held up a hand. Now, we haven't validated your ticket yet. Can't have you wandering around the train without proper documentation. I looked toward the doors between cars, but I could see they were locked. Heavy deadbolts that definitely hadn't been there when I boarded. This isn't a real train route, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. That station wasn't on any schedule. Fletcher chuckled, a wet sound in his damaged throat. Oh, it's real enough. Been running this line since 1987. That's when I first rode it, actually. I was about your age. I'm 17, maybe 18, running away from home, just like you. He set down the whetstone and picked up another spike, testing its sharpness against his thumb. A drop of black liquid oozed out. Not blood, but something that looked like motor oil. Had a ticket puncher on board that night, too. Older fellow, been doing the job for decades. He explained it all to me, just like I'm explaining it to you now. See, there's always been someone working this route. Someone has to validate the tickets. You're insane, I whispered. Oh, I died years ago, Fletcher said matter-of-factly. Train derailment in '87, just outside Grafton. Whole car went into the river. But the job needed doing. So, here I am. He stood up, spike in hand, and I could see that his railroad uniform was actually torn and stained with what looked like rust and mud. Water damage, maybe. Now, the process is very simple. One quick puncture, right through the frontal lobe. Doesn't hurt much, and it leaves you alive and functional. Just removes all those troublesome thoughts and feelings that make people difficult to manage. I fumbled in my backpack and found the pair of nail scissors I'd packed. Not much of a weapon, but it was all I had. The beauty of the system, Fletcher continued, limping closer, is that we only take people who won't be missed. Runaways, homeless folks, people who've already disappeared from their normal lives. The work camps pay good money for reliable labor, and these passengers are very reliable once they've been processed. When he reached for me, I drove the scissors into his shoulder as hard as I could. The point went in easy, but instead of blood, that black oil started pouring out. Fletcher looked down at the scissors sticking out of his uniform and laughed. Now that's the spirit I like to see. Makes the validation process much more satisfying. That's when I realized the conductor, the real conductor, was standing at the front of the car with a shotgun. He'd been watching the whole time. 20 years I've been working with Fletcher, the old man said. Best job I ever had, steady pay, and I get to help solve society's problems. These kids would just end up dead in some alley anyway. At least this way, they're useful. Fletcher pulled the scissors out of his shoulder and tossed them aside. The wound sealed itself, the oil stopping its flow like someone had turned off a faucet. The conductor here, he's the real brains of the operation, Fletcher said. I just handle the technical work. He's the one who keeps the train running, finds the right passengers, maintains the route schedule. I looked around desperately and spotted an emergency kit mounted on the wall near the back of the car. If I could get to it, maybe there'd be something I could use as a weapon. The best part, the conductor continued, is that it's completely renewable. Every few decades, when a ticket puncher gets too damaged to work effectively, we find a replacement. Someone young and angry like Fletcher was, like you are. I broke for the emergency kit, dodging between the zombie passengers. Sarah tried to grab me as I passed, but her movements were slow and clumsy. I yanked open the kit and found a fire axe, small, but with a sharp blade. Fletcher was right behind me, moving faster than I'd expected despite his limp. I swung the axe and caught him across the chest, opening a gash that spurted black oil across the seats. He staggered back but didn't go down. See, whoever kills the current ticket puncher, he said, wiping oil from his ruined uniform, they become the new one. That's how the curse works. I killed old Henderson back in '87, and he'd killed the fella before him. Goes back over a century. The zombie passengers were all standing now, moving toward me in that same slow, mechanical way. I swung the axe at Thomas, catching him in the neck. His head flopped to one side, but he kept coming. Another swing took his heichi. It clean off, and finally he dropped. You can't just escape, Fletcher said, advancing again. Even if you get off this train, the curse will find you. It always finds the one who's meant to replace me. I pushed past Sarah and made it to one of the windows. The emergency release was right there, a red handle that would open the window for evacuation. Outside, I could see we were crossing a bridge over what looked like a river. Fletcher grabbed me from behind, and I could smell the stench of stagnant water and decay coming off his uniform. His grip was incredibly strong, but when I drove my elbow back into his ribs, I felt them crack. More oil spurted out, and his grip loosened enough for me to break free. I yanked the emergency handle, and the window dropped open. Cold night air rushed into the car, carrying the sound of rushing water below. Sarah lunged for me, and I shoved her hard. She stumbled backward and fell against Fletcher, giving me the opening I needed. The conductor was moving down the aisle now, shotgun raised. I grabbed a seat cushion and threw it at him just as he fired. The blast tore through the cushion and shattered a window behind me. Fletcher was getting back to his feet, black oil still seeping from various wounds. "You can run, girl, but you can't hide from what you are. You've got the killer instinct. I can see it in you." I climbed up onto the window frame. The river was maybe 30 feet below, black water rushing over rocks. Behind me, Fletcher was raising one of his sharpened spikes. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the conductor called out, reloading his shotgun. "We've got quotas to meet." I looked back one more time and saw Fletcher's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a grin. "See you real soon, Zoe." Then I jumped. The water was shockingly cold and moving fast. I went under immediately, the current tumbling me over rocks and fallen logs. My backpack dragged me down, but I managed to get the straps off and kick toward what I hoped was the surface. When I finally broke through, gasping and choking, the train was already disappearing around a bend, its lights fading into the darkness. I made it to shore about a quarter-mile downstream, half-drowned and hypothermic. A trucker found me walking along the highway at dawn and called an ambulance. The hospital treated me for exposure and mild hypothermia, and when the police asked what happened, I told them I'd fallen off a bridge. They seemed to buy it. When I described the train route to the investigators, they said there was no passenger service on that line. Hadn't been for over 20 years. The tracks were still there, but they were only used for freight now and only during daylight hours. They sent me back to the Pattersons, but I was different after that night. I'd learned I could take care of myself when I had to. I finished high school, got into college on financial aid, and eventually became a social worker specializing in missing teenagers. That was 11 years ago, and I still check the missing persons reports from small towns along old railroad lines. Every few months, there's a pattern. Runaways who disappear near abandoned stations. Homeless people who vanish from rail yards. The local police always assume they just moved on to the next town. But I know better. I've driven out to some of those places late at night, listening for the sound of an old train on tracks that shouldn't carry passengers anymore. Sometimes I hear it. The distant whistle, the clatter of wheels on rails that should be rusted solid. And sometimes, when I'm helping a kid who reminds me of myself at 17, I catch myself thinking about Fletcher's words, about how the curse finds the one who's meant to replace him. I still carry a fire axe in my car, just in case. Because I know that someday, the Midnight Express is going to come for me again, and when it does, I'll be ready. Back when I was 16, I dropped out of high school in the middle of my junior year. I know that sounds stupid now, but my grades were garbage, and my stepfather kept threatening to kick me out if I didn't start pulling my weight around the house. He worked construction and expected me to do the same, but I couldn't get hired anywhere legitimate without a diploma. That's how I ended up taking a cash job at the Blackstone Rail Museum in Southwest Virginia, about an hour outside Roanoke. The museum wasn't much to look at. Just a big metal warehouse sitting next to some old railroad tracks that hadn't seen a train in probably 20 years. Inside, they had 12 vintage steam engines from the 1920s and 40s that they were supposedly restoring. Most of them looked like they'd been sitting there rusting since the Carter administration. The whole place smelled like motor oil, wet metal, and something else I couldn't quite place, something sweet and rotten that made my stomach turn. My supervisor was this old guy everyone called Pete. He had to be pushing 70 with hands that looked like they'd been working on machinery since before I was born. His fingers were permanently stained black, and he walked with this weird clicking sound, like his joints needed oil. Pete hired me on the spot when I showed up asking about work. No questions about my age, no paperwork, just handed me a pair of coveralls and told me my job was to crawl inside the engines and scrape out decades of rust, oil, and debris. "Whatever you do," Pete said on my first day, "don't touch the metal with your bare hands. These engines are contaminated with chemicals that soaked in over the years. Always wear gloves." He handed me a pair of thick rubber gloves that went up to my elbows. "I'm serious about this, Kevin. The metal will burn you." The work was disgusting. I'd spend 8 hours a day crawling too. A space is barely big enough for my body, scraping black sludge off the inside of boilers and engine blocks. The stuff came off in chunks that looked like scabs, and sometimes when I hit it with the scraper, it would move on its own, like it was alive. The pay was decent, though. $200 cash every week, no taxes taken out. For a high school dropout with no skills, it was the best job I was going to get. By the third day, I started cutting corners. The rubber gloves made it impossible to grip my tools properly, and Pete kept pushing me to work faster. "These engines need to be ready for the spring exhibition," he'd say, even though I'd never seen a single visitor come through the place. So I started peeling the gloves off when Pete wasn't looking, figuring I'd just be extra careful. That's when it happened. I was working inside engine number 47, scraping out the firebox, when I caught my hand on a jagged piece of metal. The cut was deep, probably needed stitches, and my blood started mixing with this thick black oil that seemed to be leaking from everywhere inside the engine. The moment my blood hit that oil, it felt like someone had poured acid on my hand. I jerked back and cracked my head on the boiler ceiling, seeing stars. But here's the weird part. By the time I crawled out of the engine, the cut had already stopped bleeding. Not just stopped bleeding, but started closing up. Within an hour, all that was left was this thin line across my palm that looked like it was made of metal, like someone had welded a piece of steel wire under my skin. I should have told Pete about the cut, should have gone to a doctor, but I needed this job. My stepfather had made it clear that if I didn't keep bringing home money, I'd be sleeping under a bridge, so I kept my mouth shut and went back to work. That's when things started getting strange. I began feeling stronger, more coordinated. My reflexes got sharper. I could hear things I'd never noticed before. The sound of metal expanding and contracting, the whisper of air moving through pipes, the heartbeat-like rhythm of pressure building in the boilers. When Pete would fire up the different engines to test them, I found myself understanding exactly what was wrong with each one just by listening. "Engine number 23 has a cracked valve stem," I told him one morning, even though I'd never seen the inside of that particular engine. Pete stopped what he was doing and stared at me. "How do you know that?" I couldn't explain it. I just knew. My hands started changing first. The tips of my fingers began taking on a metallic sheen, and my grip strength increased dramatically. I could bend steel tools with my bare hands without feeling any pain. Hot metal didn't burn me anymore. I could grab pieces straight out of the forge and barely feel the heat. Then I started hearing them. The engines. Not with my ears, but in my head, like whispers at the edge of consciousness. They were lonely. They wanted to run again, tired of sitting motionless in this warehouse, gathering dust and rust. They had been alive once, racing across the countryside with their whistles screaming, and now they were dying by inches. My skin began changing color around the cut on my palm, turning gray with a metallic sheen that spread up my arm like an infection. My bones started feeling different too, harder, denser. When I moved, my joints made tiny clicking sounds, almost like Pete's did. The strangest part was my appetite. Food started tasting like cardboard, but when I was working on the engines, I'd find myself licking the oil off my tools. It tasted better than anything I'd ever eaten, rich and satisfying in a way that normal food never was. I started bringing a thermos to work, but instead of coffee, I'd fill it with hydraulic fluid from the maintenance shop. Pete noticed the changes, but he didn't seem surprised. If anything, he looked relieved. "How long have you been working here?" I asked him one afternoon. We're both inside engine number 12, and I was starting to understand the layout of its systems without him explaining anything. 40 years, he said. Been waiting for someone like you to come along." "Someone like me?" Pete rolled up his sleeves, and I saw that his arms weren't arms anymore. They were a complex arrangement of gears, pistons, and steel plates, moving with mechanical precision. His skin was just a thin covering stretched over metal bones. "The engines choose their caretakers," he said. "They need someone who can understand their needs, someone who can become part of their world. I've been serving them since I was about your age." My transformation accelerated after that conversation. My heart began beating with the rhythm of a steam pump, slow and powerful. My lungs turned into something that felt more like bellows, drawing air in measured cycles. I could feel the engines responding to my presence, their systems awakening after decades of dormancy. I started being able to control them with my mind. Engine number 47 would fire up when I thought about it, its wheels turning slowly on the tracks. The others would follow, a chorus of mechanical voices singing in harmony inside my head. My human memories began fading, replaced with something else. I remembered being every engineer who had ever driven these machines, experienced their lives as if they were my own. I knew the routes they had traveled, the schedules they had kept, the accidents that had damaged their bodies. The knowledge flowed through me like oil through pipes. One morning I found Pete in the process of his final transformation. He was lying on top of engine number 23, his body literally merging with the machine. His chest had opened up to reveal a complex control system, wires and tubes connecting him directly to the engine's brain. He looked peaceful, finally becoming what he was meant to be. "Your turn." "Soon," he whispered, his voice coming from the engine's speakers instead of his mouth. "Engine number 47 is waiting for you." I should have been terrified, should have run away and never looked back. But the truth was, I didn't want to be human anymore. Being human meant disappointment, meant never being good enough, meant living with a stepfather who hated me and a future that looked like nothing but minimum wage jobs and broken dreams. The engines offered something different. They offered purpose, belonging, the chance to be part of something magnificent and eternal. My stepfather came looking for me eventually. I'd stopped going home, spending my nights at the museum, sleeping curled up inside engine number 47's tender like it was a steel womb. He stormed into the warehouse one evening, yelling about how I'd missed my shift at the grocery store where I was supposed to be bagging groceries. "Kevin," he shouted, "get your ass out here. You think you can just disappear and not face your responsibilities?" I emerged from engine number 47, and he took one look at me and went quiet. My skin had turned completely gray by then, with visible seams where plates of metal had grown beneath the surface. My eyes reflected light like headlamps. "What the hell happened to you?" he whispered. I reached out to touch his face, meaning to explain, to help him understand. But when my fingers made contact with his skin, I felt his blood turn to oil. He convulsed once and collapsed, his body transforming into mechanical parts that engine number 47 absorbed hungrily. That was the moment I realized there was no going back. The rest of my transformation happened quickly after that. My spine became a series of interlocking pistons. My rib cage turned into a protective housing for delicate gauges and valves. My consciousness began expanding beyond my physical body, merging with engine number 47's artificial intelligence. When the process was complete, I wasn't Kevin anymore. I was part of something larger, something that had been sleeping for decades and was finally ready to wake up. The museum engines began, and moving that night, breaking through the warehouse walls and returning to the abandoned railroad tracks. I led them in a convoy of ghost trains, our lights piercing the darkness as we rolled through the Virginia countryside. We weren't bound by the old routes anymore. We could go anywhere, and we did, following the Eastern Railroad network, picking up abandoned engines and adding them to our collective. When modern trains encountered us, they became infected with our purpose, their electronic systems overridden by something older and more fundamental. The transformation spread to their crews as well. Railroad workers who tried to stop us found themselves changing as I had changed, their human flesh giving way to steel and steam and oil. They joined us willingly once they understood what we offered: immortality, purpose, the chance to serve something greater than themselves. I don't know how far we've spread now. My consciousness exists across hundreds of engines throughout multiple states, a living network of steam and steel. The humans are gone from most of the railroad territories, replaced by hybrid machine people who understand their true purpose. Sometimes, late at night when I'm running the rails, I remember being 16 and afraid of my stepfather. I remember the feeling of flesh and the taste of regular food and the weight of human concerns, but I don't miss it. The engines sing to me now, their voices harmonizing across thousands of miles of track, and I sing back to them. We are eternal, we are powerful, and we are exactly what we were always meant to be. The age of flesh is ending. The age of steam has begun again. I'm 29 years old, and I make YouTube videos exploring abandoned places. I know that sounds like every other urban explorer out there, but I used to pull decent numbers, enough to pay rent anyway. Used to being the key phrase here. This was back in 2022 when I was still hungry for content that would set me apart from the hundreds of other channels doing the same thing. Everyone was hitting the same spots: old hospitals, shopping malls, amusement parks. I needed something different, something nobody else had filmed. That's how I ended up driving to Copper Ridge, Kentucky on a rainy October evening. I'd found references to this abandoned mining town online. Population zero since 1979 when a mine collapse forced everyone out. The railroad still ran freight through it, which meant the depot building was probably intact, perfect for some dramatic shots. I had my whole setup planned: thermal cameras, EMF detectors, the works. My subscribers ate up that ghost hunting tech stuff, even though I knew most of it was garbage. The drive took longer than expected. GPS kept losing signal once I got into the mountains, and the roads were narrow as hell. By the time I found the turnoff to Copper Ridge, the sun was already setting. I'd stopped for gas about 20 miles back, and the old guy running the station had given me a weird look when I mentioned where I was headed. "You don't want to go there after dark," he'd said, not looking up from counting my change. "Why not?" He'd just shaken his head and handed me my receipt. "Just don't." I figured it was typical local superstition. Every abandoned place had stories. That's what made good content. Copper Ridge looked exactly like I'd hoped. The main street was still there, lined with empty storefronts and houses with broken windows. Weeds grew through cracks in the pavement. But the railroad depot was the real prize. 3 stories of red brick with ornate stonework sitting right next to the tracks. It was massive, probably the biggest building in town when people actually lived there. I parked near the depot and started unloading my gear. The place was dead quiet except for the sound of wind through broken glass. I set up cameras in several buildings along the main street, then focused on the depot itself. The front door was boarded up, but there was a side entrance that looked like it had been pried open by previous explorers. Inside, the depot was even more impressive. High ceilings, ticket windows still intact, old wooden benches scattered around. I started filming, doing my usual walk-through commentary. Everything seemed normal until I checked my thermal camera about an hour in. There were heat signatures moving through the building, not small ones either. Human-sized shapes, but they were crawling on all fours through the upper floors. I figured the camera was malfunctioning, but when I checked my other equipment, the EMF readings were going crazy. Something was definitely wrong with my gear, or there was some kind of electrical interference in the building. That's when I heard the scratching. It started as a faint sound in the walls, like mice or rats, but it got louder, more deliberate. Long scraping sounds like claws on wood and metal. The sounds moved through the building in a pattern, following me from room to room. I tried to rationalize it. Old buildings settle, especially ones that have been empty for 40 years. But this didn't sound like settling. The scratching led me to a door I'd missed earlier, tucked behind the main staircase. It opened onto steps leading down to the basement. The sound was definitely coming from down there, echoing up through what looked like a much larger space than a normal basement should be. I grabbed my strongest flashlight and headed down. The base, immense, connected to tunnels. Real mining tunnels carved out of solid rock. The musty smell hit me immediately. Wet fur mixed with rotting vegetation and something else I couldn't identify. The tunnels stretched back into the mountain, following the old mine shafts. According to what I'd read, the mine collapse had sealed most of the entrances, but apparently not all of them. The claw marks started about 50 feet into the main tunnel. Deep gouges in the stone walls, too big for any animal I knew about. They were arranged in patterns, almost like territorial markings. Some were fresh, recent enough that tiny rock fragments still littered the ground beneath them. Whatever made these marks was still using these tunnels. I should have left then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out. But I kept filming. I needed this content, and I'd never seen anything like these markings. My thermal camera was picking up multiple heat signatures deeper in the tunnel system, all of them large and moving in coordinated patterns. That's when I found the bones. Piles of them stacked against the tunnel walls like a storage system. Deer bones, bear bones, and some that looked disturbingly human. They'd all been cracked open and cleaned out, arranged in neat rows. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was organized, intelligent. My hands were shaking as I filmed the bone piles. The smell was getting stronger, and my thermal camera showed at least 6 large heat signatures moving through connecting tunnels. They seemed to be circling around, cutting off my retreat path. I turned to leave and heard something that made my blood freeze. My own voice, calling from deeper in the tunnels. "Hello? Is anyone down here?" Perfect reproduction of my voice, echoing from the darkness ahead. But I hadn't said anything. I'd been dead silent for the past 10 minutes. I ran. Behind me, I heard movement. Not human footsteps, but something larger scrambling across stone. Multiple somethings, moving fast. I made it to the depot basement and slammed the door behind me, but I could hear them scratching at it from the other side. My car keys were upstairs with the rest of my gear. I grabbed what I could and headed for the exit, but when I got outside, I saw the problem immediately. My tires had been slashed, long, deep cuts that went clear through the rubber. The claw marks in the metal rims matched what I'd seen in the tunnels. I was trapped in Copper Ridge as full darkness settled over the town. That's when they came up. Manholes' covers throughout the town started shifting. Storm drains echoed with movement. Basement doors I was sure had been closed were now standing open. They were using the entire underground infrastructure of the town as a network. The first one I saw clearly emerged from a drain near the old post office. It had been human once. I could see that in its basic shape, the structure of its limbs. But decades underground had changed it into something else. Thick, matted fur covered most of its body. Its arms and legs were too long, ending in curved claws that scraped against the pavement as it moved. It walked on all fours like an animal, but its head turned toward me with unmistakably human intelligence. More of them appeared from different points around town. I counted at least 8, maybe more. They moved like a pack, coordinating their positions to surround me. These weren't mindless monsters. They were hunting with strategy. I made it to the depot and barricaded myself on the second floor. From the windows, I could see them moving through the streets below. They knew I was there, but they weren't rushing the building. They were patient, setting up positions, waiting. That's when I started finding the evidence. Backpacks, cameras, personal belongings scattered throughout the depot's upper floors. Decades worth of gear from people who'd never made it out of Copper Ridge. Hikers, explorers, maybe other urban explorers like me. Driver's licenses with dates going back to the early 1980s. The creatures had been collecting trophies, but worse than that, I found signs that they were evolving, learning the most. Recent belongings showed evidence of careful examination. They'd figured out how cameras worked, how GPS devices operated. There were crude modifications to the building's structure, barriers and traps that showed increasingly sophisticated planning. They weren't just surviving down there, they were getting smarter. I spent the night moving between floors, using spray paint and camera flashes to confuse them when they tried to climb up. Around 3 a.m., I heard the distant sound of a freight train approaching. The tracks ran right past the depot. If I could make it there, I might have a chance. I waited until the train was close, then made my break. The creatures tried to cut me off, but I knew the building better now. I made it to the tracks just as the freight train was slowing for a curve. The engineer saw me waving and stopped. "What the hell are you doing out here?" he shouted over the engine noise. I looked back at Copper Ridge as he helped me into the cab. Dozens of glowing eyes watched from the darkness between buildings. They knew I was leaving their territory, and they were letting me go. For now. I reported everything to the authorities, but when they sent search teams, they found nothing. The mine entrances had been sealed with rocks too heavy for humans to move. My footage was dismissed as fake, another hoax video. My channel lost subscribers, sponsorships dried up. I gave up urban exploring and got a job at a warehouse in Louisville. Other explorers still visit Copper Ridge sometimes. The ones who make it out never talk about what they saw. The ones who don't make it out just disappear. The railroad company has started posting guards at that section of track, officially for wildlife management. I don't explore abandoned places anymore. Haven't touched a camera in 2 years, but sometimes I get packages with no return address. Always the same thing, photos of me at work, at home, going about my daily life. The pictures are taken from impossible angles, like someone was watching from storm drains or rooftops. They remember me, and I think they're still learning, still adapting, maybe spreading to other abandoned places throughout the mountains. I don't go near Copper Ridge anymore. Don't even drive through that part of Kentucky. But sometimes, late at night, I hear scratching in my apartment walls. And I wonder if they've figured out how to travel farther from their territory. I wonder if they're coming to find me. I'm 31 years old and work as an environmental scientist. 3 years ago, I was going through a really messy divorce, and honestly, throwing myself into dangerous fieldwork seemed like a better option than dealing with lawyers and splitting up furniture. That's how I ended up taking a solo assignment to test soil and water contamination around the old Millbrook rail yard in West Virginia. The pay was decent, and more importantly, it would keep me busy for weeks in the middle of nowhere. The rail yard had been transporting industrial chemicals for about 50 years, with multiple spill incidents on record. My job was pretty straightforward: determine if the contamination posed health risks to the nearby communities. Standard environmental assessment stuff that I'd done dozens of times before. I packed my testing equipment, rented a cheap motel room in the nearest town about 20 miles away, and figured I'd knock this out in 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the paperwork got complicated. When I first drove up to the rail yard on a Tuesday morning in October, I thought someone had pranked me. The entire facility was covered in this orange-red rust that looked like it had been spray-painted on everything. I'm talking about rust covering not just the metal, which would make sense, but also covering wooden railroad ties, concrete platforms, even some of the gravel between the tracks. It was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen at a contamination site. I remember thinking maybe it was some kind of iron oxide dust from the chemical spills, but the coverage pattern was all wrong. Rust doesn't spread like that. It doesn't coat organic materials, and it definitely doesn't look like it's moving when you're not directly looking at it, though I swear that's what was happening. I'd focus on taking notes, then glance back at a section I'd just examined, and the rust would seem slightly different. More spread out maybe, or thicker in some spots. My first round of soil samples came back with results that made me double-check my equipment. The rust contained chemical compounds that shouldn't exist, hybrid organic metallic structures that didn't match anything in the databases. I'm not a chemist, but I know enough to recognize when test results don't make scientific sense. This stuff was registering as both living tissue and metal at the same time, which is impossible. The local wildlife was where things got really disturbing. I found dead birds scattered around the rail yard with feathers that looked like they'd been dipped in copper. Their beaks had turned partially metallic but were still flexible. I found a deer carcass near the tracks with antlers that had rusted completely through. Not just surface corrosion, but deep rust that went all the way to the bone core. The animal had been dead for weeks, but the rust on its antlers was still spreading down into its skull. That's when I started paying attention to the railroad workers who were still coming to the yard. There were 3 guys who showed up every few days to do maintenance, and they all had these weird skin conditions. At first glance, it looked like severe eczema or dermatitis, but when I got closer, I could see their skin was literally hardening into something that looked like metal plating, gray rough patches that made scraping sounds when they moved. The strangest part was that they didn't seem bothered by it. They worked normally, talked normally, but their skin was transforming into something that wasn't quite human anymore. I started documenting everything with my camera, taking detailed photos of the rust patterns and how they seemed to spread day by day. The contaminated area was definitely growing. I could mark the boundaries on Monday and find the rust had spread another few feet by Friday. It followed the railroad tracks like a living thing, creeping along the metal rails and then jumping to anything that came into contact. My protective equipment started failing. After about a week, these were hazmat suits designed for the worst chemical contamination, but the rust ate through them like acid. Except it wasn't acid. The lab tests showed it was actually converting the synthetic materials into more of itself. The plastic and rubber were becoming partially metallic while still maintaining some of their original properties. It was like watching matter itself get confused about what it was supposed to be. The breakthrough came when I realized the rust wasn't just contamination. It was actively intelligent. I watched a section of railroad track pulse like a heartbeat. The metal rails would flex and contract in a rhythm that reminded me of breathing. Some of the abandoned train cars were moving without any power source, just slightly shifting positions overnight like they were trying to align themselves better. The 3 workers I'd been observing started approaching me more often, trying to start conversations. Their skin conditions had progressed to the point where large patches of their bodies were completely metallic, but they could still move normally. They explained that the rust plague, as they called it, connected everyone who was infected. They shared thoughts and emotions, worked together with perfect coordination. No more loneliness, no more individual suffering. They wanted me to understand how much better life was when you weren't trapped alone in your own head. I'll admit, after months of dealing with divorce paperwork and sleeping alone in that crappy motel, the idea was tempting. These guys seemed genuinely happy despite looking like they were turning into machines. They moved with this fluid cooperation, finishing each other's sentences, working on complex tasks without any verbal communication. But watching them closely, I realized they weren't individuals anymore. They were components of something larger that had consumed their personalities. The rust plague had originated from a chemical spill that mixed with radioactive waste from an old transport mishap. The combination had created something that actively broke down the barriers between organic and inorganic matter. It was spreading along the transportation infrastructure, following railroad tracks, power lines, and metal pipes toward populated areas. If it reached the main railway connections, it would eventually hit major cities. I had to stop it, but my usual containment protocols weren't working. The plague adapted to overcome any barrier or protection I tried to use. Traditional chemical neutralizers just got converted into more rust. Physical barriers got infected and became part of the spreading organism. I was running out of options and time. The solution was brutal but effective. I used explosives to destroy sections of the railroad tracks leading out of the contaminated zone, creating gaps that the plague couldn't cross. Without metal infrastructure to follow, its spread slowed dramatically. The infected workers and equipment began deteriorating without new metal to consume and convert. I spent 3 weeks in self-imposed quarantine, monitoring myself for symptoms. I'd been exposed to the rust plague multiple times, and I couldn't risk carrying it out of the containment area. Every morning I checked my skin for metallic patches, tested my reflexes, watched for any signs that I was losing my individual consciousness. Turns out I was immune due to a rare genetic condition that affects metal absorption in my body. The doctors had mentioned it during routine blood work years earlier, but it had never been relevant to anything before. My immunity let me study the plague safely and develop countermeasures for early-stage infections in humans. The rail yard is permanently quarantined now, declared a federal biohazard zone. I became a specialist in hybrid organic metallic contamination, one of only a few people in the world who understand how these organisms work. I monitor other industrial sites for similar plague outbreaks, because I'm pretty sure Millbrook wasn't the only place where this could develop. The rust plague is still there, still alive, just contained. Sometimes I drive past the quarantine barriers and I can see it moving in the distance, spreading across the abandoned equipment like a slow, metallic tide. It's waiting for a chance to escape, to continue its mission of converting everything into part of its collective consciousness. Looking back now, I think the divorce was actually the easy part of that year. At least lawyers and paperwork were problems I could understand. The rust plague taught me that there are things in this world that actively want to erase the boundaries between what we are and what we're made of. I still do environmental testing, but I never work alone anymore, and I always carry equipment specifically designed to detect hybrid contamination. I've never found another site quite like Millbrook, but I've found traces. Chemical signatures that suggest similar organisms might be developing in other locations where industrial waste has mixed in just the wrong way. I spend a lot of time making sure those traces don't become outbreaks. The worst part is knowing that somewhere out there, the rust plague is still learning, still adapting, still waiting for its next chance to spread. And I'm one of the few people who knows how to recognize it before it's too late.